Elias Crow walked into the Whitlock kitchen without knocking. That was the first thing Mara noticed, not his expensive boots, not the leather satchel he carried, not even the way her father scrambled to his feet, like a man who'd been caught doing something shameful. It was the door. He hadn't knocked. He'd simply turned the handle and walked in, the way a man walks into a room he already believes belongs to him. He set a folded paper on the table and looked at Mara the way a rancher looks at livestock he's already paid for. 30 days, he said. Or the ranch goes, and so does she. Her father said nothing. Her cousin Lydia, standing near the window, looked at the floor. And Mara stood in her own kitchen, holding a cast-iron skillet she'd been washing, and understood that the two people she'd given the last 3 years of her life to had already made this decision without her. If you've ever been sold by someone who claimed to love you, stay with me. Because this story is about what a woman does when she finds out her own family put a price on her. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. These are the stories that stay with you. Drop your city or country in the comments right now to see. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Texas, 1887. The town of Garnet Flats sat at the edge of a flat, ungenerous stretch of land that got too little rain and too much wind. And the people who'd built their lives there had absorbed both qualities without meaning to. They were lean people, careful with words, careful with money, careful with anything that might be taken from them before they were ready to let go. Mara Whitlock was not lean. She was large, broad-shouldered, thick-armed, standing nearly a head taller than most of the women in the county and several of the men. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and a laugh that, when she allowed it, could be heard 3 rows back at a Sunday gathering. She was 31 years old, and she had spent most of those years learning, with the slow, grinding certainty of someone who keeps getting the same lesson, that the world had a very specific idea of what a woman should look like, and that she wasn't it. She had known this since she was 9, when a woman at the dry goods store told her mother, loud enough for Mara to hear, that it was a shame the girl hadn't taken after her. She had known it at 16, when the boy she'd liked married a woman 2 years older, simply because that woman was small and soft and easy to stand next to without feeling outshone. She had known it every year since, in every sideways glance, every comment wrapped in concern, every suggestion that she might want to eat less, move differently, take up less space in rooms that had never been built for her anyway. But Mara had never let the world's opinion of her body determine what she did with it. Her hands could set a fence post faster than most hired men. She could read a horse's injury from 20 paces. She knew which pastures held moisture longest in a dry summer, which sections of their land would flood first in a hard rain, which cattle were worth breeding, and which would only eat resources they didn't have. She had kept the Whitlock Ranch functioning for the past 3 years, not her father, not any hired hand, not any man who'd ever looked at her and found her wanting. Caleb Whitlock was 62 and aging faster than he admitted. He'd had a bad fall from a horse 2 winters ago that left his right hip stiff in cold weather, and cold weather in Garnet Flats arrived in October and didn't fully release its grip until April. He could manage the books, handle conversations with buyers, and represent the family at county meetings with the careful dignity of a man who understood appearances. What he could no longer do was run a ranch. That work had passed to Mara so gradually that neither of them had ever formally acknowledged it. She didn't resent him for it. That was the honest truth, the part she would have had trouble explaining to anyone who hadn't watched their own parents age. She loved her father with the complicated, durable love of someone who has seen a person's limitations up close and decided to stay anyway. She worried about him. She wanted him to be safe, wanted the land to remain theirs, wanted to honor the 27 years her mother had poured into that soil before her lungs gave out 2 summers ago. What she had not wanted had never considered, had not been warned about in any form was this. The debt had been real. She knew that. The ranch carried 4,700 in notes to a lending house in Abilene. Debt accumulated over 5 years of bad weather and one catastrophic cattle illness that had taken 11 head in a single month. Mara knew the number because she was the one who'd balance the ledger every Sunday evening by lamplight while her father slept. She knew what they owed. What she had not known, what no one had told her, was that Elias Crow had purchased that debt 3 weeks ago. Elias Crow was 54, a widower, and the largest landowner in the county by a margin that felt almost architectural, as if the rest of them were simply living in the gaps between what he'd accumulated. He had come to Garnet Flats 8 years earlier from somewhere in Arkansas that he rarely mentioned specifically. And he had bought land the way other men collected grievances, steadily, without sentiment, always at the moment, when the seller had the least room to negotiate. He was not cruel in the way that announced itself. He was patient. He waited for people to become desperate, and then he offered them relief that cost more than the original problem. He had been watching Mara for 2 years. She hadn't known that either. Lydia Vale had known. Lydia was Mara's cousin, 26 years old, and she had moved into the Whitlock house after her own father died, presenting herself as help with the household and company for Caleb in his declining health. She was small, pretty, and possessed of a particular kind of social intelligence that Mara had always respected without fully understanding the ability to read a room, to know who held power and where it was flowing, to position herself near warmth before the cold arrived. It had been Lydia who'd introduced Crow to Caleb at a county meeting 6 months ago. It had been Lydia who'd told Crow, in a private conversation Mara was never supposed to know about, that the Whitlock ranch was struggling and that Caleb was not the one keeping it together. It had been Lydia who'd suggested delicately and with apparent concern that a woman like Mara might benefit from the security of a good marriage. She had meant well, or she had told herself she'd meant well, which is a different thing entirely, but often feels identical from the inside. When Crow walked through that door without knocking, Mara's first response was not fear. It was confusion. She recognized him. She'd seen him at gatherings, had even spoken to him briefly twice, but his presence in her kitchen at 7 in the morning, with a leather satchel and a folded paper, made no immediate sense. She set the skillet on the counter and waited. "Mr. Crow," she said. "I prefer early," he said. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was looking at Caleb. Her father was already standing, already nodding, already wearing the expression of a man who has been dreading a moment for weeks and has finally arrived at it and found, as people often do, that the arrival is somehow both worse and simpler than the anticipation. "Mara," Caleb said. "Sit down, I'll stand." Crow set the satchel on her kitchen table, on the table where she'd eaten every meal of her life, where her mother had taught her to make pie crust, where she'd sat with her father and worked through the ledger every Sunday, and he opened it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this before, in other kitchens, with other families. "Your father's debt," he said, "which I now hold, comes to 4,700, due in full." He pushed the paper toward her, 30 days. Mara looked at the paper. She looked at her father. "When did you sell the note?" 3 weeks ago, Caleb said. He didn't meet her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" "There's more," Crow said. The room went very quiet. Mara heard the wind outside and the sound of the horses in the near paddock and her own breathing, which had gotten very controlled and deliberate the way it always did when she was working hard, not to show what she was feeling. "The 30 days is negotiable," Crow said. "In fact, the debt itself is negotiable, entirely." He paused. He had the timing of a man who enjoyed this part, who had learned exactly how long to let silence sit before filling it. "If you agree to become my wife." Mara looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, at his clean shirt and his expensive boots and his patient, confident expression. The expression of a man who believes the answer is already settled and is simply waiting for the formality of being told so. Then she looked at her father. Caleb Whitlock, who had taught her to ride, who had held her hand at her mother's grave, who had told her, the week her mother died, that the two of them would manage just fine because they were Whitlocks. And Whitlocks did not quit. That man was standing in his own kitchen, with his eyes on the floor, saying nothing. "Is this what you want?" she asked him. Her voice was steady. She had learned to keep her voice steady even when everything inside her was not. "You want me to marry him?" Caleb finally looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. "I want us to keep the ranch." "That's not what I asked." He looked away again. Mara picked up the document. She read it, all of it, every line. Not the way a panicked person scans a paper, but the way she read anything important. Slowly and with full attention. She noted the amounts, the dates, the signature at the bottom that was undeniably her father's. She noted the name at the top, Elias Crow. She noted the date the note had been transferred, which was exactly 3 days after she'd told her father they needed to approach the Abilene lender about restructuring. He had already sold it by then. He'd been negotiating with Crow while she was planning. Put the paper back on the table. "No," she said. Crow's expression didn't change. "You have 30 days. I heard you the first time." She walked to the door and opened it. "Should go." He looked at her for a moment, the way he'd looked at her when he walked in, the assessing look, the look that was deciding what something was worth. And then he picked up his satchel and walked out. He didn't hurry. He didn't argue. He had the calm of a man who had given someone 30 days and knew, with considerable certainty, how those 30 days were going to end. Mara closed the door behind him. Then she turned to her father. "How long?" she said. "How long have you been talking to him?" "Mara, how long, Dad?" Caleb sat down. He looked suddenly old in a way that went beyond his age, the kind of tired that comes not from working too hard, but from carrying something you shouldn't have picked up in the first place. 2 months, he said. Maybe a little more. 2 months. She had been running the ranch, making plans, working towards solutions for 2 months, while her father was negotiating her like a parcel of land. "Did you know?" she said to Lydia. Lydia was still standing near the window. She had said nothing since Crow arrived. Now she pressed her lips together and looked at Mara with an expression that was either guilt or something trying very hard to look like guilt. "I only wanted to help," she said. "We have no options, Mara. The man is wealthy. He's established. He walked into our house without knocking." Mara said, "That's what he is." She went outside. She needed the air and the space and the particular silence of the land in the morning before the day got loud. She walked to the fence at the edge of the near pasture and put both hands on the top rail and stood there, looking out at the 40 acres her grandmother had broken with her own hands, and she breathed. 30 days, 4,700. Her father, who loved her, had decided the best use of her life was to solve a financial problem. Fury she felt was real and hot and entirely justified. But underneath the fury, working quietly and with considerably more patience, was something else, a mind that was already calculating. She had the 40 acres of scrubland on the eastern edge of the property land her father had written off years ago as too poor to graze, but that sat at a position. So Mara had realized 2 months ago that would matter enormously to any rancher trying to access the new watering rights along Culver Creek. Land wasn't worthless. It was strategically located, which was a different thing. She had 3 breeding cattle, the Dunmore stock her mother had purchased as calves, which had grown into animals any serious cattle operation in the county would pay well for. Together, if she could find the right buyer, at the right price, those assets were worth somewhere close to 4,000, 700. Problem was finding that buyer in 30 days, without appearing desperate. Desperation, she'd learned, had a way of cutting the price of everything in half. She had met Silas Boone 3 weeks ago at the Sunday gathering, where she'd brought the cornbread that everyone ate and no one complimented because the woman who'd made it didn't look the way women who made good cornbread were supposed to look. He'd been standing alone near the edge of the gathering, watching the crowd with the contained, measuring attention of someone who was new enough to still be figuring out who was who. He was 50, Maybe a few years more, with weathered hands and an unhurried way of speaking that she'd noticed immediately, not because it was charming, though it was, but because it suggested he was the kind of man who'd learned that speaking too fast usually meant you weren't actually listening. He'd been the one to walk over to her, not the other way around. "You made the cornbread," he'd said. "How do you know that?" "'Cause you're the only one who's been watching to see if anyone liked it." She'd laughed genuinely, without thinking about whether it was too loud. And he'd smiled at the laugh, not at the body it came from, not at the fact that she was large, or that her dress didn't fit the way they said it should. He'd smiled at the laugh itself, as if it was simply something worth smiling at. She had thought about that 3 times in the days since, not with the particular hope she'd long since learned to distrust, but with the careful attention she paid to things she hadn't quite worked out yet. Silas Boone had purchased the old Harland Ranch at the north end of the county 6 months ago and was in the process of building a serious cattle operation. He had money, not Crow's kind of money, not the accumulated, other people's expense kind, but the earned kind, the slow kind. He was not a man who would buy distressed land as a charity. He would buy it if it was worth buying. Mara thought the Eastern 40 was worth buying. She thought she could make that case. The question was whether she could make it without making it a plea. Pushed off the fence rail and walked back toward the barn. She had horses to check on and a fence on the west pasture that needed a new post before the week was out. And she did the math quickly in her head, and she always did, approximately 28 days left to solve a problem that 2 people she loved had decided she couldn't solve. She was going to solve it anyway, not to prove them wrong, though she wasn't going to pretend that wasn't part of it. But because the ranch was hers, as much as it was her father's, and because her mother's hands were in that soil, and because no one, not Elias Crow, not 30 days, not 4,700, was going to make her into someone else's solution to someone else's problem. She picked up the fence post repair kit from inside the barn door and headed west across the pasture. Behind her, the house sat quiet in the morning light, the door still closed, the kitchen still holding the ghost of a conversation that had changed everything. Mara didn't look back. She fixed the fence post that morning, all 3 of them. Actually, she'd only planned on the one. But once she got out there with the tools in her hands and the flat Texas sky above her and nothing between her and the horizon but dry grass and her own thoughts, she kept working. It was the kind of labor that had always made sense to her in a way that conversation rarely did. You found the problem. You fixed it. You moved to the next one. Post went in straight or it didn't. The wire held or it didn't. There was no room for the kind of ambiguity that filled every room of that house right now. She didn't go back inside until noon. Her father was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for something unpleasant and has decided that staying very still might delay its arrival. Lydia was nowhere in sight. Mara washed her hands at the basin, dried them on a cloth that needed washing, and sat down across from him. "Tell me everything," she said. He did. It took a while. Came out in pieces, the way difficult truths usually do, not in one clean confession, but in layers, each one requiring a moment to settle before the next could be added. Debt had been mounting for 2 years. He'd known it was worse than he'd told her. He'd believed, with the particular stubbornness of a man who'd built something and couldn't accept watching it go, that something would change a good season, a strong cattle price, something. When Lydia had mentioned Crow's interest, Caleb had told himself it was just a conversation, just exploring options, just seeing what was possible. "You let it go further than a conversation," Mara said. "I thought it would protect you." "From what?" He looked at her across the table, at the daughter who'd been running his ranch for 3 years, who'd set fence posts that morning before he'd finished his first cup of coffee, who was sitting here right now asking him hard questions with a steadiness that made him ashamed of himself in a way he hadn't expected to feel at 62. "From having to carry all of it," he said finally. "Debt. The worry. I thought if there was someone who could, you thought if I married him, The problem would go away. You'd be taken care of. I take care of myself, Mara said. The words came out quiet, not angry, which was somehow worse. I have been taking care of myself, and you, and this ranch, for 3 years. You know that. You've watched me do it every single day. She paused. And still, when it got hard enough, your first thought was to find a man to hand me to. Caleb set down his cup. His hands were shaking slightly, not from anger, but from the particular tremor that had started in the past year, the one he pretended wasn't getting worse. I didn't mean it like that. I know you didn't. She stood up. That's almost the harder part. She left him sitting there and went to her room, the small room off the back of the house that had been hers since childhood, with the window that looked east toward the scrub pasture and the horizon beyond it. She sat on the edge of her bed and did the thing she always did. When she needed to think clearly, she made a list. Not on paper. In her head, the way her mother had taught her, going through each item slowly, enough to actually see it. What she had: 40 acres of eastern scrub, 3 Dunmore breeding cattle, 26 days, and whatever was left of her reputation in this county as someone whose judgment could be trusted. What she needed: $4,700 in cash or equivalent in the hands of whoever currently held the note before Crow could do anything else with it. What she could not afford: to look desperate, to undersell, to let anyone know the 30-day clock was ticking before she'd already solved the problem. The Eastern 40 was the key. She'd figured that out weeks ago, back when she'd been planning the debt restructure that her father had made irrelevant by selling the note before she could act. The land wasn't good grazing. It was too rocky, too dry, too inconsistent in its drainage, but it sat at a specific position that would become important. The moment anyone with significant cattle holdings in the north of the county wanted reliable creek access. Culver Creek's water rights had been a county-level argument for 2 years. The resolution, when it came, was going to favor the eastern approach. Mara had read the survey documents and attended the county meetings, and had reached this conclusion 6 months ago. She was reasonably certain she was right. She was less certain that she could explain it to a buyer without sounding like she was selling something she'd inflated. She needed a buyer who would understand land value at a level beyond what was sitting on top of it. She thought about Silas Boone. She thought about him carefully, the way she thought about any significant decision, not with the warmth she'd felt at the gathering, not with the embarrassing flicker of something she wasn't ready to name, but with the clear-eyed practicality she applied to everything that mattered. What did she actually know about him? He'd bought the Harlan place, which meant he had access to capital. He'd bought it without visible negotiation or distress, which suggested the capital wasn't stretched thin. He was building a cattle operation from the north end of the county, which meant creek access would eventually matter to him. He had looked at her, really looked at her, at the person she actually was, and that told her something too, not about romance, but about the quality of his attention. A man who notices things, notices everything. That was either an asset or a complication, and she hadn't decided yet which it would be. She made her decision the following morning. She saddled her horse before 6, told no one where she was going. Lydia was still asleep, and her father didn't come down until 7 and rode north toward the Harlan place. The morning was cold and clear, and she rode with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has somewhere specific to be and has already calculated exactly how long it will take. An hour and 20 minutes of riding, give or take, depending on the condition of the North Road after the rains last week. Took an hour and 15. The Harlan place had changed. She hadn't been out this way in 2 years, and the transformation was real, not finished, not polished, but purposeful. New fence lines running true and straight. A repaired barn roof. The gate at the entrance had been rehung, so it actually closed level, which the original gate never had in 30 years of her knowing it. Someone had been working this land with clear intention, and she noted each sign of it as she rode in. Because the condition of a ranch tells you exactly who is running it if you know how to read it. A man came out of the barn as she was tying her horse. Not Silas, a young hand, maybe 19. who looked at her with the particular uncertain expression of someone who wasn't sure if a large woman arriving alone at 6 in the morning was good news or bad. "Is Mr. Boone available?" she said. "He's inside the house." The hand looked like he might offer to go get him, then reconsidered. "Go up." Silas answered the door with a coffee cup in one hand and the expression of a man who has been up for a while and was not particularly surprised to have a visitor, though he was clearly not expecting this one specifically. He was wearing work clothes, not dressed up, not dressed for receiving. Just a man in his own house at an early hour, looking at someone standing on his porch. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "I'd like to discuss a land transaction," she said. "Time." He looked at her for a moment, that same quality of attention she'd noticed at the gathering, the kind that didn't rush to fill silence, and then he opened the door wider. "Come in. There's coffee." The kitchen was cleaner than she'd expected, which she immediately felt guilty for not expecting. A working kitchen, functional, with the remnants of breakfast on the counter and a ledger open on the table, that he closed without making a production of it. Poured a second cup and set it in front of her without asking how she took it, which she'd have been annoyed by, except that he also set the sugar and the small pitcher of milk beside it and stepped back, leaving the choice to her. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. She took the coffee black. "The Eastern 40 on my family's property," she said. She didn't preamble it. She'd decided on the ride over that the worst thing she could do was build toward it slowly, as if she needed to warm him up to the idea. A man who understood land deals would read that as nervousness. It abuts the Culver Creek Survey Corridor. "I've been following the water rights case for 2 years. When the county resolves the Eastern Access dispute, and it will resolve in the next 12 months, the survey data is already pointing that direction. That 40 acres becomes a strategic position for any large cattle operation working the North Range." She stopped. "You're working the North Range." Silas set his cup down. "How much?" "I need a fair price." "Not a favor." She looked at him directly. "I want to be clear about that. This is a business transaction. I have 3 Dunmore breeding cattle I'd include in the sale. Together, the property and the animals are worth between $4,500 and $4,900 at honest market value. I'd want $4,700 even." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, not perform. Thinking, actually think, which was different. His eyes moved slightly, the way a person's eyes move when they're running numbers or turning a problem over. Why 4,700 specifically? She had prepared for this question. She had also decided on the ride here that she was not going to lie. "Because that's what I need. Not what I want, what I need. You asked, so I'm telling you. The debt." She looked at him. "You know about it. Word travels," he said. "Small county." He picked up his cup again. "I hadn't heard specifics. Just that the Whitlock Ranch was carrying some weight. Carrying $4,700 to Elias Crow, who bought the note from the Abilene lender 3 weeks ago." She said it flat, without the bitterness she actually felt, because bitterness in a negotiation is a liability. "He's given us 30 days. His preferred resolution is not financial." Silas was still for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, not pity, something more contained than either. "His preferred resolution is you." "That's correct. And you're here because you want to pay him off yourself." "I'm here," Mara said, "because I have something worth buying. And you're a man who buys things worth buying. That's the entire reason." She held his gaze. "I don't need rescue. I need a buyer." He was quiet again. Longer this time. She made herself sit with the silence and not fill it, which was one of the hardest things she regularly had to do, because her instinct, when she felt uncertain, was to keep talking. She kept her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes level and waited. "I'd want to see the land," he said. "Of course." "And the cattle. They're on the property. You can see them same day." "All right," he paused. "I have one condition." She waited. "When you go to pay Crow," he said, "I want to come with you, not speak for you, not in front of you, beside you." He said it plainly, without decoration. A man like that in a situation like this, having a witness, changes the room. He won't be able to claim later that you were confused about the terms, or that you agreed to something you didn't agree to. I'd be there as a witness. Nothing more. Mara looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the deed that morning, carefully, looking for the part that would cost her something she wasn't prepared to pay. She didn't find it. You understand that means I'm also a witness to your presence there, she said. People will draw conclusions. Let them. I'm not in a position to. She stopped. She had been about to say she wasn't in a position to be the subject of speculation right now, which was true, but it also wasn't the real thing she'd been starting to say. The real thing was more complicated, and she wasn't willing to say it out loud in a man's kitchen on a Tuesday morning. People will talk, she said. Instead, people already are, he said, and there was nothing unkind in it. Just the simple level acknowledgement of someone who had been in a small county long enough to understand how it worked. She drank her coffee. She thought about it for roughly 30 seconds, which was than it had taken her to make most of the significant decisions in her life. And then she said, "All right, good." He stood up. "I can ride out to see the land this afternoon if that works." Works. He came that afternoon with his foreman, a quiet man named Rhett, who had the measuring eyes of someone who has assessed a lot of land and has the patience to do it right. The three of them walked the Eastern 40 without much conversation, Silas asking questions that told her clearly he had already looked at the county survey maps, Rhett taking his own notes, both of them moving across the rocky ground with the unhurried focus of people who were actually looking at what was in front of them, and not just going through a required motion. Then they went to the south pasture, and Silas looked at the 3 Dunmore cattle with a long, careful attention, walking around them, checking their condition, asking about their breeding history and their temperament and the calves they'd produced. Mara answered every question. She had raised those cattle from before they were a year old. She knew things about each of them that weren't in any ledger. By the time they finished, the afternoon light was going gold, and the temperature was dropping, and Rhett had gone back to his horse. Silas stood at the fence, looking at the cattle for another long moment, and then he turned and looked at Mara. She saw in his expression that he had made up his mind. 4,700, he said. Even. Cash transaction. I'll have it ready in 3 days. 3 days, she repeated. I'll have a formal sale document drawn up. You'll want to read it before you sign it. I always read everything before I sign it. He almost smiled. I know. She rode home in the dark, which she'd done hundreds of times, and which held no particular fear for her, except the fear of her own thoughts, which had a tendency in the dark and the quiet to get louder than she liked. She thought about what she'd just done, not with regret, but with the particular close attention she paid to decisions she'd made and couldn't unmake. She had sold her grandmother's eastern pasture. She had accepted the help not help. She corrected herself. A transaction. A fair transaction of a man she'd met 3 weeks ago and trusted because he'd noticed the cornbread and hadn't knocked on her knee in the process. She wasn't sure if that was enough reason to trust someone with 4,700. She decided by the time she reached home that it was. Not because she felt it in some romantic, instinctive way, but because she had watched him walk those 40 acres and she had seen, in the questions he asked and the things he looked at, a man who understood exactly what he was buying and did not pretend it was something else to make her feel better about selling it. That was all she'd asked for. A fair transaction between 2 people who could see each other clearly. The 3 days moved differently than any 3 days before them. Mara worked the ranch. There was always something to work, always something needing her hands or her judgment or both. And she managed her father with the careful, exhausting patience of someone who loves a person and is also genuinely angry at them and has decided for the time being to keep both of those things compartmentalized because there isn't space right now to unpack either one. Caleb knew what she was doing. She told him plainly. She had found a buyer for the Eastern 40 and the Dunmore cattle. She was using the proceeds to pay Crow's note, and they would discuss the rest afterward. He tried to say something. She held up a hand. Afterward, she said, Lydia tried twice to have a conversation. The first time, Mara said she wasn't ready. The second time, Lydia started with I only wanted to, and Mara said, quietly but completely, without room for argument, I know what you wanted. I'm not ready to talk about it. Lydia went silent after that. She was useful around the house, she always had been. And Mara let her be useful without making it into anything else. On the third day, Silas arrived at the Whitlock ranch with a leather document case and a bank cashier's note for $4,700. He sat at the kitchen table with Mara, not with Caleb, not with Lydia, with Mara, and they went through the sale document line by line. It was a clean document, straightforward. The eastern 40 acres, described precisely by its boundary markers. The 3 Dunmore cattle, described by their marks. Price, the terms. Nothing she hadn't expected, nothing buried. She signed it. He signed it. They shook hands across her kitchen table, and she felt the firmness of his grip, not aggressive, not performative, just solid, and thought that this was the most honest transaction she'd had in years. I'll go with you tomorrow, he said. To Crow's. Tomorrow morning, she said. Early. I'll be here at 7. He arrived at 6:55. The ride to Crow's estate took 40 minutes, and they did most of it in a quiet that she didn't feel the need to fill. Silas rode on her left, slightly behind, in the natural positioning of someone who is present but not leading. She noted that. She noted it the same way. She'd noted the coffee cup and the document, and everything else not with gratitude, exactly, but with a kind of careful recognition. Some things deserved to be seen clearly, even when you weren't sure what they meant yet. Crow's estate was the largest private property in the county, and it announced itself the way everything he owned did, with the comfortable certainty of a man who has never had to wonder if what he has will last. The main house was stone and timber, larger than anything else in the valley, with a front approach that was clearly designed to make whoever was walking up it feel small by comparison. Mara rode straight to the front door. A man came out, not Crow, a worker who looked at the two of them with the particular calibrated wariness of someone employed by a man who likes to manage his own surprises. Mr. Crow isn't expecting visitors, he said. He'll want to see us, Mara said. She didn't say it as a request. Crow came out 2 minutes later. He was dressed well. As always, the dressed well of someone who understood that appearance is a form of pressure. He looked at Mara, then at Silas, and something moved across his face that he controlled very quickly, but not quite quickly enough. He hadn't expected Silas. He'd expected Mara alone, probably coming to negotiate, or to beg, or to offer some alternative arrangement that he could then shape in his favor. He hadn't expected $4,700 in her hand. She held out the bank cashier's note. Payment in full, she said, on the Whitlock debt, dated today. Crow looked at the note. He took it. He had to take it. There was no graceful way not to, and he looked at it with the expression of a man who is reading something he doesn't want to believe, says what it says. He looked at Silas. Silas said nothing. He was simply there, watching, with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who isn't going anywhere. This clears the debt, Mara said. In full. I'd like the original note returned. Crow was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through it, looking for the angle, the counter, the thing he could say that would reframe the situation in his favor. He was a man who'd spent years finding those angles, and she'd known, riding out here this morning, that he was going to try. She'd prepared for it. But what she hadn't prepared for what she would think about later, replaying the morning in her mind, was what he did next. He looked at her with something that was not quite defeat and not quite anger, but something more unsettling than either. He said, I should tell you, Miss Whitlock, that this settles only part of the matter. Mara went very still. Your father, Crow said, signed a second note. The words landed the way a bad fall lands, not with warning, just with sudden, total impact. A second note. Mara stood on Elias Crow's front approach, with the morning light coming hard off the stone walls of his house, and the $4,700 cashier's note she'd just handed him still in his fingers, and she felt something move through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite rage, and was entirely both at the same time. Kept her face still. She had learned years ago that the most dangerous thing you could do in front of a man who was waiting for your reaction was give it to him. "Show me," she said. Crow looked almost pleased with himself, which was worse than if he'd gloated openly. Open gloating, you could answer. This was the satisfaction of a man who had been patient for a long time and was now watching his patience pay out exactly the way he'd planned. He reached into his jacket. He'd come out of the house already dressed, she realized, which meant he'd known. She was coming before his man had told him, which meant someone had told him, and produced a second document, folded in thirds, which he opened and held out to her. Took it. She read it. Her father's signature was at the bottom. The amount was $2,600. The date was 4 months ago. 2 months before Crow had approached the family. 2 months before Lydia's conversation. 2 months before any of this had allegedly begun. The lending party named on the note was not the Abilene house. It was a private instrument, a personal loan, drawn between Caleb Whitlock and a land investment firm out of Dallas that Mara had never heard of. She read it again, slower. Then she looked at Crow. This note was never with the Abilene lender. "No," he said. "It was not. You bought it separately, some months ago, yes, before I approached your father about the first." She understood it, then all of it, the whole shape of it, and the understanding was worse than the surprise had been. He hadn't bought the Abilene debt and then found out about the second note. He'd bought both of them, deliberately and in sequence, before he'd ever walked through their door. He'd held the second note back, kept it hidden, while they scrambled and planned and sold the Eastern 40, and he'd let her believe one payment would end it. He'd watched her solve the first problem, with full knowledge that a second one was waiting underneath it. The 30 days, the morning visit, the patient, confident expression. He hadn't been giving her a chance. He'd been running a clock. The remaining balance, Crow said, is $2,600. My offer remains the same as before. He folded his hands in front of him, unhurried. Both notes disappear, all of it, in exchange for your agreement to marry me. Silas had not moved. He was standing 2 paces to Mara's left, and slightly behind her, exactly where he'd been since they arrived, and she did not look at him, because she couldn't afford to look at anything right now, except the man in front of her, who had just revealed that everything she'd fought for in the last 3 weeks had been a room he'd built around her. "No," she said. Crow's expression didn't shift. I heard you." Her voice was flat and hard and very quiet, which was different from the loud anger he'd probably expected, and harder to deflect. "The answer is no. Whatever the number is, the answer is no. I want that on record, Mr. Crow, in front of a witness, so that when I tell people what happened here today, there's no confusion about what you asked and what I said." Crow glanced at Silas for the first time. Silas looked back at him without expression. The way a man looks at something he's already decided the value of and found disappointing. "I'll give you time to consider," Crow said. "I don't need time," Mara said. "I need a copy of that note." He let her read it again, but he did not give her a copy. She memorized what she could, the name of the Dallas firm, the date, specific instrument number, and then she handed it back to him and turned and walked to her horse and mounted with the efficient, unhurried movement of someone who is not running away, but who is done with this conversation. Silas mounted beside her. They rode out through the gate at the same unhurried pace they'd ridden in. Neither of them spoke for nearly 10 minutes. Then Silas said, "He had both before he came to your house the first time." "Yes." "He planned the whole sequence." "Yes." Another silence. The road back toward Garnet Flats was flat and straight, and the wind was coming sideways off the north pastureland, cold and dry and smelling of dust. "What do you need?" Silas said. Mara thought about the question. Not the surface of it, money, obviously. That was the surface, but the whole of what he was actually asking. What did she need right now, this morning? Riding back from a man who had just told her that 3 weeks of planning and sacrifice and one of the hardest decisions she'd ever made had amounted to clearing only half of a trap she hadn't known was double-layered. Time, she said finally. And the name of whoever drew up that Dallas instrument. I need to find out if that note is legitimate. What do you mean? Legitimate? Private note drawn 4 months ago, through a firm I've never heard of, signed by a man who doesn't read documents carefully? She looked at him. My father signs what's put in front of him when he's tired and worried, and someone tells him it'll help. He's done it before. I need to see the original instrument, not Crow's copy. Silas was quiet for a moment. You think it might be fraudulent? I think I need to verify it before I pay it. She looked back at the road, and I think Crow is counting on me not having time to do that. They rode the rest of the way back, without talking much, and Mara spent that time going through the list in her head, the new list, the one that started from this morning's revelation, and worked forward. She had no more assets to sell without compromising the ranch's operating capacity. The Eastern 40 was gone. The Dunmore cattle were gone. What remained was functional, but not liquid. She needed either to verify the second note was fraudulent and fight it legally, or find 2,000. 600 from somewhere she didn't currently have, or both, and she needed to do it while Crow was counting on her to do neither. When they reached the Whitlock property line, she stopped her horse at the gate and looked at Silas. Thank you, she said, for today. I didn't do much. You were there. She said it without elaboration, because elaboration would have turned it into something she wasn't prepared to name yet. That was what I needed. He nodded. He seemed about to say something and then didn't, which she appreciated more than whatever the something would have been. He turned his horse north and rode back toward his own property, and she watched him go for a moment before she turned and went in. Her father was in the kitchen. He'd heard her come through the gate. She knew because he was positioned at the table in exactly the way he positioned himself when he was waiting to be told something and was afraid of what it would be. Lydia was there too, and this time Mara didn't have the patience to manage it. She sat down across from her father, and she put the facts on the table the same way Crow had put his document down that first morning, direct, without ceremony. There's a second note, she said. Dallas firm, 2,600, signed 4 months ago. Caleb went pale. Not the pale of surprise, the pale of someone who has been dreading the arrival of a specific thing and has now watched it arrive. You knew, Mara said. He stopped. He pressed his lips together and looked at the table. I thought it would buy us time. What kind of time? Cattle prices were supposed to improve. There was talk of a contract through the Hendricks buyers out of Fort Worth. I thought, if we just had another few months. Dad. She waited until he looked at her. Crow bought that note before he bought the Abilene one. He bought it months before he ever walked through our door. He knew about it. He planned all of it. She watched her father's face as the weight of that settled onto him, and she made herself keep watching, even though it was hard, because she needed him to understand it fully. He gave us 30 days on the first note, knowing that even if we paid it, he still had this one. He wanted to watch us solve an impossible problem, and then show us that there was another one underneath it. Caleb's hands were flat on the table, and his face had gone from pale to something worse, the gray, diminished look of a man who has just understood the full consequence of decisions he made while telling himself they were temporary. I'm sorry, he said. It came out very small. I know. Mara looked at her hands for a moment. I need to know everything. Every debt, every note, every conversation with Crow or anyone connected to him. Everything. There's nothing else, he said. I swear to you, Mara, there's nothing else. She looked at him. She decided, not without reservation, to believe him. Lydia had been silent through all of it, sitting at the far end of the table, with her hands folded and her eyes moving between Mara and Caleb, with an expression that was working very hard to be neutral, and not quite managing it. What happens now? She said, when the silence had gone on long enough. Now I figure out if the Dallas note is clean, Mara said, and then I figure out how to pay it. She spent the rest of that day and all of the following morning working the problem. She wrote 2 letters, one to a land records clerk she knew in Abilene, who had helped her verify property boundaries 2 years ago and who had a reliable eye for instrument documentation, and one to the county recorder's office asking about any registered interests associated with the Dallas firm named on Crow's note. She kept the letters factual, asked specific questions, gave nothing away about why she was asking. She sent them with the afternoon post and tried not to count how many days she had left while she waited. 7 days passed. In those 7 days, the county held its monthly gathering a meeting, nominally, about road improvement and water access, which everyone attended partly for the business, and mostly because it was the primary social event in a county, where social events were the only thing that broke the isolation of ranch life into something bearable. Mara went, because she always went, and because not going would look like something she had no interest in advertising. She was standing near the food table, talking to Agnes Petty about the water access resolution. Agnes's husband ran a small ranch on the east side and had been following the Culver Creek case as closely as Mara had when Elias Crow walked in. He had brought the note. She didn't realize it at first. She saw him come in, watched him work the room with the practiced socialese of someone who'd been managing impressions for decades, and she turned back to her conversation with Agnes and made herself focus on what Agnes was saying about the creek survey. Then she heard the room change, not a noise, exactly, but a quality of attention, the particular shift that happens when something unexpected enters a space, and everyone registers it without quite knowing they have. Turned. Crow was standing in the middle of the room with the second note in his hand. Timed it. She understood that immediately, with the cold, clear recognition of someone watching a move they should have anticipated. He'd waited until the room was full, until the county commissioner and the circuit judge and half a dozen property owners and their families were all present and paying attention, and then he'd walked in with the note and let the room notice him holding it. "Believe," he said, loud enough to carry without shouting, which was its own skill, that there are matters of public record that the community ought to be aware of. The room went quiet, not all at once, but in the spreading, rippling way that quiet moves through a crowd when someone with authority, real or manufactured, begins speaking. Mara stood very still. Crow laid it out cleanly. He was good at this, better than she'd given him credit for, which she filed away as a lesson. He explained the debt, both notes, their combined total, the terms of repayment. He said nothing. That was technically false. He didn't need to. The facts arranged the way he arranged them: the struggling ranch, the aging father, the daughter who'd managed to scrape together payment on the first debt only because a neighboring rancher had bought her land, painted a picture that was accurate in its pieces and completely dishonest in its whole. "I have offered," he said, "a complete resolution. A fair arrangement that would settle both debts and provide the Whitlock family with security they clearly need." He paused. "Miss Whitlock has declined. I respect her decision, but I feel it is important that the community understands the position the ranch is now in." He was not asking the community to pressure her. He didn't need to. He knew how small counties worked. He knew that the pressure would come on its own, from neighbors who meant well and from neighbors who didn't, from the quiet accumulation of concern and pity and judgment that was already beginning to form in the faces around the room. Mara felt it, the shift in how people were looking at her, some with sympathy, some with the particular brand of concern that is really just curiosity wearing better clothes, and some she could see in the careful sideways glances, with the satisfied expression of people who had always privately believed she was too large, too capable, too much for her own good, and were now watching what happened to women like that. She walked forward. She didn't plan it, or rather she planned it in the 3 seconds it took her to cross the space between where she'd been standing and where Crow was standing, which was enough time to make one decision and stick to it. She walked to the center of the room, and she turned to face not Crow, but the people around him. "I want to be clear about what Mr. Crow is describing," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her slightly because her pulse was not. "There are 2 debts. Together they total $7,300. I paid the first. The second, Mr. Crow has held since before he ever approached my family bought privately in advance from a Dallas firm, as part of a plan to ensure that no matter what we did, he retained a claim against us. She looked around the room, at the commissioner, the judge, at Agnes Petty and her husband, at the 15 or 20 people who were listening. He is not offering a fair arrangement. He is offering to make the debt disappear in exchange for my agreement to marry him. I have declined. That is my right. And I will find the 2,600 the same way I found the first 4,700 without his assistance. The room was very quiet. Crow had not expected her to speak. She saw it in the slight adjustment of his posture, the half-second recalibration of a man who had set a stage, and watched the person he'd set it against walk into the middle of it and rearrange the furniture. The debt is legitimate, he said. Whatever the method of acquisition. I haven't claimed it isn't, Mara said. I've claimed that the method reveals your intent. There's a difference. A voice from the back of the room said, "She's right about that." Mara didn't look to see who'd said it. She kept her eyes on Crow. "The offer stands," Crow said. His voice had not changed. He was very good at not letting his voice change. "When you've reconsidered, you know where to find me." He folded the note and put it back in his jacket, and he left the way he'd come in, unhurried, without apparent embarrassment, with the carriage of a man who considers this a temporary setback and not a defeat. The room stayed quiet for another moment after he left, and then it released, the way a room releases when a pressure lifts, and conversation started up again in the low, careful tones of people processing something they hadn't expected to see. Mara stood where she was for a moment. Her hands were steady. Pulse was not. Agnes Petty appeared at her elbow. "That man," she said quietly, "has been doing this to people in this county for 8 years. "I know," Mara said. No one's ever said it out loud before. Mara looked at her. Agnes was 60 small, with the weathered face of someone who'd run her own house through hard seasons and hadn't been soft about it. "Has he done this to you?" Mara said. Agnes pressed her lips together. "My husband settled. Years ago." She didn't say more than that, and Mara didn't push. But she filed it away, the way she filed everything. She found Silas on the edge of the gathering. He'd been there the whole time she'd seen him when she walked forward, registered him in the peripheral way you register things you're not focusing on directly, and he looked at her now with the steady, unhurried attention that she was beginning to understand was just how he looked at things he took seriously. "You handled that well," he said. "I handled it," she said. Whether it was well remains to be seen. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the Dallas firm. "I sent a wire to a business contact in Dallas 3 days ago. I should have a response by the end of the week." She looked at him. "You did that on your own." "You mentioned the name of the firm when we were riding back." "I wrote it down." She processed that. He'd ridden home from Crow's estate and written down the name of the Dallas firm from a passing comment she'd made while they were riding, because he'd understood, without being told, that verifying the note's legitimacy was the right move, and that her resources for doing it were limited. He hadn't announced it. He hadn't asked if he should. He'd just done it. She didn't know what to do with that. She put it in the same place she'd been putting everything about Silas Boone, the coffee cup, the document, the way he rode beside her and not in front, and told herself she'd sort through it all later, when there was time. "Thank you," she said. "It's information," he said. "Favor." The response arrived 4 days later. Silas wrote it over himself rather than sending it, which she would have found presumptuous from anyone else, and found, from him, simply practical. They sat at the kitchen table. Caleb was out in the yard. Lydia was hanging washing, and Silas laid the wire response flat between them. The Dallas firm was legitimate. Mara had hoped, in the way you hope for things you don't actually believe, that it wouldn't be. The business contact had confirmed. The instrument was a real private lending operation, registered and operating, with a history of purchasing distressed notes from rural lending houses. Nothing fraudulent in the structure of the note itself. "So it's real," she said. "The note is real," Silas said. "But there's something else." He pointed to the second paragraph of the wire. Contact checked the firm's acquisition records. They sold that note to Crow 11 months ago. Mara read the date again. 11 months ago. That was 3 months before her father had even borrowed the money from them. She did the arithmetic twice, which she didn't need to do but did anyway, because the number was important enough to be certain about. That's not possible, she said. No, Silas said. It's not. She looked up at him. He looked back at her, and she saw in his expression the same thing she felt, not triumph, because this wasn't simple enough for triumph, but the complicated particular feeling of something falling into place that changes the shape of everything you thought you were looking at. Crow hadn't bought the note after Caleb signed it. He'd bought the instrument before Caleb had even borrowed the money, which meant the Dallas firm hadn't sold Crow a note on an existing debt. They'd sold him an instrument in advance, a mechanism for a debt that hadn't been created yet, but that Crow had already arranged would be. He set it up, Mara said. It came out very quiet. He arranged for my father to borrow from that firm. He sent someone to offer the loan. He already owned the debt before my father knew the lender existed. That's what the dates say. She sat back. The full architecture of it was visible to her now, the whole shape, and it was worse than she'd understood even that morning at Crow's estate. He hadn't just held back a second note. He had constructed both notes, from the beginning, as components of the same plan. Her father hadn't stumbled into debt with a Dallas firm. He'd been guided into it, probably by someone presenting as a friendly lender with favorable terms, and Crow had been waiting on the other end the whole time. This was not opportunism. This was not a man who'd seen vulnerability and moved toward it. This was something more deliberate, more patient, more cold than that. Can we prove it? She said. The dates prove the timeline, Silas said. Whether a judge looks at the timeline and reaches the conclusion we're reaching, that's a different question. We need the circuit judge to see the original acquisition documents from the Dallas firm, not Crow's copy of the note, the original transfer of the instrument with the dates. She was thinking out loud now, which she rarely did in front of other people. But Silas was listening with the focused attention of someone taking notes, even when they weren't writing anything down. If we can show he owned the instrument before the loan was made, we can argue the loan itself was a manufactured debt, that it was designed to be collected by Crow regardless of whether my father could pay. Fraud argument. Yes. Do you have a lawyer? She looked at him. I have a father, a cousin, and a ranch that's currently operating at the minimum capacity needed to break even. She paused. No, I don't have a lawyer. Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear Lydia pulling the washing off the line, the snap of fabric in the wind. There's a man in Beaumont, he said. Name of Corrigan. He handled land fraud cases for 3 years before he came west. He's not cheap. I know you don't. He said it without impatience. I'm offering to cover the cost. She opened her mouth. Not a gift, he said before she could speak. A loan. The same terms I'd expect from any business partner whose case I was financing, because it was the right thing to do, and because I have reason to believe it'll succeed. Written down. Formal, repaid when you're in a position to repay it. She closed her mouth. She thought about it. Really thought about it. Because the instinct to refuse was real and strong, and rooted in something deeper than pride, in the knowledge that money and obligation had a way of reshaping relationships into something you hadn't agreed to. But this wasn't shapeless. He was offering specific terms, a formal arrangement, the same structure. She would have insisted on herself if the positions were reversed. I want to see the terms before I agree, she said. Course. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? He held her gaze for a moment. Because Crow has been doing this to people in this county for 8 years, he said. And because you're the first person who stood up in a room full of witnesses and said it plainly. He paused. And because I bought land from you at a fair price, and I'd like to continue doing business in a county where the rule isn't that whoever has the most money gets to own people. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. Once. Get me the terms, she said, and send the wire to Corrigan. Outside, the wind shifted, coming from the south now, warmer than it had been all week, carrying the smell of the far pasture and the dry creek bed and everything that was still hers to fight for. Pushed back her chair and stood up. There was work to do. Corrigan arrived on a Thursday, which was also the day the weather finally broke. The rains came in, the night before, not the tentative, apologetic kind that left the ground damp and little else, but the real kind that filled the creek beds and turned the unpaved road into something you had to think about before you drove a wagon through it. Mara had been up since before dawn, listening to it on the roof and thinking about what she needed to say to a lawyer she'd never met, a man Silas vouched for but who was still, at his core, a stranger being paid to care about her problem. She was not good at being helped. She knew this about herself, the way you know things about yourself that you've confirmed repeatedly over years. Not as a flaw you're working on, but as a fact you've learned to account for, the way you account for a fence post that leans slightly west and always will. She was going to have to let Corrigan help her. She was going to have to hand him information and trust him to use it well, and wait while someone else did the part of the work she couldn't do herself. That was going to require more patience than fixing fence posts, and she was going to manage it, and she was not going to enjoy a single minute of it. Corrigan was shorter than she'd expected. She didn't know why she'd built him taller in her mind, probably the same reason people build lawyers taller, as if the authority of the profession ought to require a certain physical presence. He was maybe 5'8", slight, with a dark beard going gray at the edges and the particular kind of eyes that looked like they were doing several things at once. He shook her hand with a firmness that suggested he'd learned early on not to adjust his grip for women, which she appreciated before she'd consciously decided to. Silas had come with him. She'd expected that too. Silas had arranged the contact, paid the initial retainer, and she understood by now that he was not the kind of man who set things in motion and then stepped back to let them conclude without him. She had decided somewhere between the second and third day, after they'd sat at her kitchen table with the wire from Dallas, that she was not going to fight his presence in this. She would have fought it 3 weeks ago. She was tired of fighting things that weren't actually threats. They sat at the kitchen table, Silas, Corrigan, and Caleb, who had insisted on being present and whom Mara had decided to allow because excluding him from the consequences of his own decisions felt more like punishment than practicality. Lydia stayed in the other room. Mara hadn't asked her to. She'd made that choice herself, which Mara noted without comment. Corrigan had read the wire from Dallas before he'd left Beaumont. He asked his questions methodically, without visible urgency, writing in a small leather notebook with a pencil he kept sharpened, which struck Mara as the kind of detail that said something true about a person. He asked the sequence of the loans when Caleb had first been approached about the Dallas borrowing who had approached him, what terms had been offered. He asked about Crow's original visit, about the note from Abilene, about the timing of every contact Crow or anyone connected to him had made with the Whitlock family. Caleb answered, haltingly, sometimes with the backward-circling quality of a man who is telling a difficult story and keeps finding pieces he'd forgotten to include, but he answered. Mara's listened and didn't interrupt, even the 3 times she had additional information and had to physically make herself hold it until Corrigan's question opened the space for it. This was not her interview to run. When Corrigan got to the Dallas firm, he set his pencil down. "The man who approached you about the loan," he said to Caleb. "Did he give you a name?" "Beaumont," Caleb said. "Thomas Beaumont. He said he was a representative of the Dallas firm." "Did he show you documentation?" "He had papers." I didn't read them carefully." Caleb looked at the table. He'd been looking at the table for most of this conversation, and Mara had stopped reading, meaning into it, because there were only so many ways a man could signal shame before the signal became part of the furniture. He said the terms were good. I believed him. "Was there anyone else present when you signed?" Lydia was in the next room. Corrigan picked his pencil back up. "I'll need to speak with her." "I'll get her," Mara said. Lydia came in and sat down in the chair Mara vacated, and Mara moved to the counter and stood there while Corrigan asked Lydia about the signing, where she'd been, what she'd heard, whether she'd seen the man who'd brought the papers. Lydia answered carefully, in the way she always answered difficult questions, with an awareness of how her words would sound. But she was accurate. Mara had expected her to hedge or soften things, and she didn't. She told Corrigan that the man had arrived at the house in a good buggy, that he'd spent less than an hour, that Caleb had come to find her afterward, and said he'd arranged for some additional funding that would give them breathing room, she'd thought. At the time, it seemed quick for something that important. "Did you tell anyone about the loan?" Corrigan asked. Lydia hesitated. A half-second barely visible, but Mara caught it. "I mentioned it," Lydia said. "To someone in town. I didn't know it was a problem." "Who?" Mara said. The room was quiet. "I ran into Mr. Crow at the dry goods store," Lydia said. She didn't look at Mara. "He asked how the family was managing. I said we'd found some additional funding." I didn't know, Mara. I didn't know what it meant." Mara was quiet for a moment. She was looking at her cousin at the careful, contained expression that Lydia wore when she was afraid of what was coming, which Mara had learned to read over years of living in the same house, and she was doing the thing she always did, which was sorting the pieces into what was true and what the truth meant. Lydia had told Crow about the loan. Not knowing, she was confirming something he'd already set up, not knowing she was handing him the confirmation that his manufactured debt had been accepted. She hadn't meant harm. She had, in her particular way, caused it anyway, writes Mara said. Her voice came out even. "Thank you, Lydia." Lydia looked at her. "I'm sorry. I know." Mara looked at Corrigan. "Is that useful?" "It establishes Crow's awareness of the loan almost immediately after it was signed," Corrigan said, "which, combined with the acquisition dates, builds the pattern." He made a note. "It's not proof on its own, but it's a thread." What Corrigan was building toward, and he explained this to them at the table that afternoon, with the particular clarity of a man who understood that his clients needed to know the shape of the fight in order to stay in it, was a claim of fraudulent inducement. The argument was not simply that Crow had acquired the debt through questionable means. The argument was that the debt itself had been manufactured, that the Dallas firm, acting on Crow's direction or in concert with him, had sent a representative to the Whitlock property to create the debt, which Crow then purchased in advance, before the transaction ensuring he would hold the claim regardless of the lending arrangement's outcome. The Beaumont visit, the quick terms, the favorable presentation, all of it was consistent with someone sent specifically to get its signature, not to establish a genuine lending relationship. "If we can find Beaumont," Corrigan said, "or establish a connection between Beaumont and Crow, the case becomes considerably stronger." "How do you find a man who may not have used his real name?" Mara asked. "You start with what's verifiable. The buggy. A good buggy in a small town is noticed. The dry goods keeper, the livery, anyone who saw him arrive or leave." He paused. "And the Dallas firm's registration. If Crow was directing the firm's activities, his name may appear in their registered business interests." "Public record," Silas said. "I can wire my Dallas contact again. He's already been pulling records." Corrigan nodded. "Do that." When Corrigan and Silas finally left Corrigan to the boarding house in town where he'd be staying while he worked the case, Silas to his ranch, the house settled into the particular quiet that follows a long, difficult day. Caleb went to sit on the porch, which he did when he needed to think, or when he needed to stop thinking, and wasn't sure which one he was actually doing. Lydia washed the cups from the afternoon coffee without being asked, which was her own version of making herself useful when she was carrying something she didn't know what else to do with. Mara stood at the window and looked out at the south pasture in the fading light, and tried to locate the thing she was feeling, which was complicated enough that she hadn't named it yet. She was afraid. She allowed herself to know that plainly, without dressing it up as something else. Case could fail. Corrigan was good. She believed that, But good lawyers lost cases, and the circuit court's judgment on something as nuanced as manufactured fraud was not guaranteed in any direction. They lost, the $2,600 was still owed. If they lost, she had no more assets to liquidate. They lost, the ranch would need to be surrendered, or she would need to find $2,600 from somewhere that didn't currently exist. Still, the anger hadn't metabolized the way she'd expected it to. She'd thought, over the weeks since Crow's first morning visit, that the anger would burn hot and then settle into something more manageable. Cold, practical focus she could actually work with. Instead, it had become a specific, low-burning thing directed at specific, concrete targets. At Crow, whose patience and planning had been aimed at a human being, as if she were a problem to be acquired rather than a person to be known. The circumstances that had made her father vulnerable enough to be guided into signing something he hadn't understood, and, if she was being honest with herself, and she was here by the window in the fading light, with no one watching at herself for not seeing it earlier. She had been so focused on solving the problem that she hadn't looked beneath the problem to see who'd built it. She went to her father on the porch. He was sitting in the old rocker that had been there since she was small, looking out at the land in the way he'd looked at it her whole life, with the mix of ownership and worry and love that she'd always understood as the particular expression of a person who built something and is terrified of losing it. She sat down on the porch step and leaned her back against the post and looked out at the same view. For a while, neither of them said anything. The frogs had started up near the creek after last night's rain, and the sound of them carried across the pasture, the steady, biological insistence of creatures doing the only thing they knew to do. When I was building this place, Caleb said not to open a conversation, just the way older people sometimes speak, as if a thought has been moving through them long enough that it finally has to come out. I was so certain it was going to last. That was the point. That was the whole point. Something that lasts. It's still standing, Mara said. Because of you, he said it quietly, without the particular weight of a compliment, just the weight of a fact that had been sitting in him for a while. I used to tell myself I was protecting it, that I was still the one running things. He stopped. I wasn't, haven't been, for a long time. Mara didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't be either cruel or dishonest, and she had run out of patience for dishonesty and wasn't interested in cruelty. I made it worse, he said, trying to protect something by hiding things from the person who was actually keeping it alive. He looked at her. I know that. I've known it for a while. Why didn't you tell me about the Dallas loan? He was quiet for a long moment. Because you'd already done so much. Because I couldn't stand watching you carry one more thing that I should have been carrying myself. He looked back at the pasture. That was pride. Mine, not yours. Mara looked at her hands on her knees. Big hands, like her mother's, which had always been described as unfeminine until Mara had watched them work for enough years to understand they were just hands doing what hands needed to do. I don't need you to carry everything, she said. I never did. I just needed you to tell me the truth about what we were dealing with so I could deal with it. He nodded slowly. I know that now. You knew it before, she said, not unkindly. You just chose different. He didn't argue with that. She respected him for not arguing with it. They sat on the porch until the light was gone and the frogs were the loudest thing in the dark. And then Caleb got up, slowly, with the careful movement of a man managing a hip that didn't work the way it used to, and went inside. Mara stayed on the step for a while longer. She was thinking about the county gathering, about what Crow had done in front of all those people and what she had done in response, and about the faces she'd seen when she'd finished speaking, not all of them sympathetic. Some of them curious in a way that didn't quite distinguish between wanting her to win and wanting to watch, but some of them genuinely changed. Agnes Petty's expression. The man in the back who'd said she was right about the difference between a method and its intent. The circuit judge who'd been standing near the east wall, and whose expression she hadn't been able to read, but who'd been listening with his full attention. Thought about Crow, too. about the fact that he'd attended the gathering knowing she'd be there, that he'd brought the note with him, that he'd staged the entire thing with the careful preparation of someone who'd done this before and expected it to work. She had disrupted his stage by walking into the middle of it, but disruption wasn't victory. He still held the note. He was still counting on her running out of options before the case could be built. She needed to buy Corrigan the time to build it. 2 days later, she did something she had never done before. She asked for help, directly, explicitly, without framing it as a transaction or a business arrangement or anything other than exactly what it was. She rode to Agnes Petty's house. Agnes answered the door with flour on her hands and the expression of someone who has learned to answer the door with whatever state she's in rather than pretending she wasn't in the middle of something. She looked at Mara and said, "Come in. The bread's just shaped." They sat at Agnes's kitchen table with coffee and the comfortable practicality of two women who have never been close friends but have always had a certain respect for each other's competence. And Mara explained where the case stood: Corrigan, the Dallas acquisition dates, the Beaumont visit, the argument they were building. Agnes listened without interrupting, which was its own form of intelligence. When Mara finished, Agnes said, "What do you need from me?" "You said Crow had done this to other people in the county," Mara said. "Your husband settled years ago. Are there others?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "At least 2 other families that I know of. Maybe more who haven't said." She looked at her coffee cup. The Harland family sold their place under what the county was told were voluntary terms. But Vera Harland told me privately that they'd been carrying debt Crow held, and he'd given them the same offer he gave you. Roy didn't fight it, just sold and left. "Silas bought the Harland place," Mara said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a piece of the picture. Silas bought it at a fair price, as I understand it," Agnes said, "from Crow, who'd taken it from Roy Harland at considerably less." She paused. Silas didn't know the history. "I don't believe that man would knowingly benefit from what Crow does." "No," Mara said. "I don't think he would either." She looked at Agnes. "Would the Harlands be willing to talk to Corrigan?" "A pattern of behavior strengthens the fraud argument considerably." Agnes thought about it. "I can write to Vera," she said. "Can't promise anything. Roy's a proud man, and this embarrassed him badly." "I understand," Mara said. "Just ask." She stopped at 2 other properties on the way home. Both conversations were hard in the particular way that conversations about shame are hard. The people she spoke to had spent time building the story of their losses into something manageable, and she was asking them to take that story apart again in front of a stranger. One family said no immediately. The other, a widow named Clara Marsh, who'd lost the northern 40 of her property 3 years ago to a debt. She still didn't fully understand, said she needed to think about it and would send word. Clara sent word the next morning. She would talk to Corrigan. The Dallas wire came back 4 days after Silas had sent it. His contact had gone deeper into the registration records of the Dallas firm and found, in the subsidiary business interests, listed at the time of the firm's county registration, a name E. J. Crow, listed as a capital investor, with a 15% interest in the firm's operating revenues. Elias Crow had not merely bought notes from the Dallas firm. He had been a partial owner of it. Corrigan read the wire at the Whitlock kitchen table and set it down with the careful deliberateness of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and wants to be precise about what it means. "This connects him to the instrument at the point of creation," he said. "He wasn't a third-party purchaser of a legitimate debt. He was a financial participant in the entity that issued the debt. That changes the legal character of the transaction entirely." "Is it enough?" Mara asked. "It may be enough for a fraud finding on the second note." He paused. "It does not automatically extinguish the first note. The Abilene debt was legitimate. But if the court finds fraud on the second, it affects his standing to collect on either because it establishes a pattern of predatory intent. And if the Harland pattern is introduced, then we're not arguing an isolated transaction. We're arguing a method." Corrigan looked at her. "This is winnable, Miss Whitlock." I want to be honest with you. Courts are unpredictable, and nothing is certain. But the evidence we have is substantial. The acquisition dates, the investment connection, the Beaumont visit, and if Miss Harland agrees to speak, a demonstrated pattern across multiple properties. He closed his notebook. I want to file this week. She looked at Silas, who was sitting across the table and had been quiet through most of Corrigan's summary, with the focused attention she'd come to recognize as his version of processing something important. He looked back at her. File it, she said. The filing happened on a Wednesday. Corrigan rode to the county seat and submitted the complaint with the circuit court, and by Friday afternoon the county knew about it, not through any announcement, but through the ordinary transmission of information in a small place, which was thorough and fast and mostly accurate, and occasionally embellished in ways that were impossible to control. By Sunday, the version circulating. The evidence was that Mara Whitlock had produced documentary evidence that Elias Crow had manufactured debts against multiple county families, which was close enough to the truth to be useful, and overstated enough to make Crow's Sunday slightly uncomfortable. Crow's response was not what Mara had expected. She'd expected retaliation of some kind, a counterfiling, a legal challenge to the fraud complaint, something that demonstrated his resources and his intention to fight. Instead, he went quiet. He attended no public gatherings in the 2 weeks after the filing. His workers were visible on his property, but he himself was not. The silence had a quality to it that she found more unsettling than noise, because silence, from a man like that, usually meant he was doing something she hadn't anticipated yet. Corrigan came to the house 12 days after the filing to prepare her for the hearing. He brought his notes and his organized patience and his sharpened pencil, and he sat with her for 2 hours going through every question she might be asked, every point Crow's legal representative might challenge, every moment at which she would need to be precise rather than emotional and precise rather than quiet. He practiced it. Not performance. She wasn't building a performance. She was building clarity, which was different. The difference was that performance was about impression, and clarity was about truth. And the truth of this case was on her side in a way that she trusted. But on the evening before the hearing, something happened that she hadn't prepared for. Silas came to the house, which was not unusual. By now he'd been in and out regularly through the weeks of case preparation, dropping off wire responses, reviewing documents with Corrigan, being simply present in the way he was present, which was useful and undemonstrative and oddly steadying. But this evening he came alone, after supper, when the house was quiet and her father was already in bed, and Lydia had gone to visit a neighbor. He knocked. She answered the door and saw in his expression that he had something to say that he'd been carrying for a while and had decided tonight was the right time to set down. She let him in. They sat in the front room. She offered coffee, which he declined, and then they were just 2 people sitting in a quiet house the evening before something significant, and she waited for whatever it was. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want to be clear that I'm not saying it because of tomorrow, or because of the case, or because I think it changes anything about how you should handle any of it. She waited. When I bought the Harland place, he said, I thought I was just buying land. I didn't know the history. I found out after that Crow had pressured Roy Harland out of it, and I should have done something with that information. It was new to the county. I told myself it was settled. It was Roy's business to fight if he wanted to fight it. He paused. I didn't do anything. That bothers me. Mara looked at him. You're doing something now. Because you're doing something now, he said. I want to be honest about that. I'm not the one who walked into the middle of that room at the gathering and said what needed to be said. You did that before I decided to do anything. I'm following your lead, Mara. I want you to know I know that. She was quiet for a moment. The thing she'd been keeping in that place, the coffee cup, the document, the way he rode, the wire from Dallas seemed to shift, the whole collection of it, reorganizing itself into something with a clearer shape. Why are you telling me this tonight? She asked. He looked at her steadily. Because I wanted you to hear it before tomorrow. Not after, when it might look like I was saying it, Because things went well. He paused. And because I think you've spent a long time around people who told you things after it was convenient for them, and I didn't want to be one of those people. She held his gaze. Outside, the creek was running with the rain from the previous week, audible from the front room. In a way, it usually wasn't a steady, real sound. The sound of water doing what water does when it finally gets enough of it. "I'll see you in the morning," she said. He nodded, stood up. He went to the door and then paused with his hand on the frame and said, without turning all the way back, "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already made it harder for him to do this to the next family." He left without waiting for an answer. She sat in the front room for a while after he'd gone, listening to the creek and the house settling around her. And she thought about what was true, about what she'd built in the past weeks, out of almost nothing. Not nothing, she corrected herself. Out of the specific things she actually had, which were her own intelligence and her willingness to be honest, and the careful, accumulating presence of people who had chosen, each in their own way, to stand in the same direction she was standing. Corrigan with his sharpened pencil. Agnes Petty with her letter to Vera Harland. Clara Marsh with her one-word message. Silas, who had just told her the truth about himself at the exact moment when it would have been easier not to. She thought about Lydia, who was out at a neighbor's house, and who had been, in the past 2 weeks, doing a quiet, careful work of figuring out what she actually believed, apart from what she'd been taught to want. Mara didn't know where that ended, but she could see it happening, and she thought it was real. She thought about her father, asleep down the hall, who had tried to protect things by hiding them, and had learned, at 62, with the particular difficulty of learning late, that protection built on concealment wasn't protection at all. And she thought about herself not with the editorial distance she usually applied, but plainly. She had been told her whole life that she was too much, too large, too capable, too unwilling to make herself smaller. She had spent years believing that the world's objection to her was about her body, her size, the physical space she occupied. She understood now that it had never been about that. It had been about what she refused to give up: her voice, her judgment, her right to take up the space she'd earned. Tomorrow she was going to a hearing that would determine whether a man who'd built a trap around her family was going to be held accountable for building it. She didn't know how it would go. She was not a person who pretended certainty she didn't have. But she had Corrigan's sharpened pencil and the Dallas acquisition dates, and Clara Marsh, and whatever Agnes had managed with Vera Harland. And she had a lifetime's practice of facing the thing in front of her without looking away. She got up, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. She woke before the alarm she'd set, which was a candle marked at an inch, which she'd used since childhood, because clocks in the Whitlock house had always been unreliable, and she'd learned early to find other ways to measure time. Candle had burned to the mark and gone out on its own, and she lay in the dark for a moment, listening to the creek still running, and the horses in the near paddock, and her own heartbeat, faster than usual, and which she acknowledged without apology. She was afraid. She had been afraid before. Fear was not the problem. Problem was only ever whether you let it make your decisions for you, and she had a long history of not doing that, and she intended to continue it. She dressed carefully. Not in her best. She didn't own what most people would call a best dress. And showing up to a circuit court hearing in something that looked borrowed or strained would communicate the wrong thing entirely. She wore the dark wool skirt she kept for county business, a clean white blouse, and the boots she'd resoled twice because they fit right, and good-fitting boots were worth maintaining. She braided her hair with the plain competence of someone who has braided their own hair every morning for 30 years and thinks about it approximately as much as breathing. She looked at herself in the small mirror on her dresser and saw exactly what. Was there a large woman, with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw, and 3 weeks of hard decisions written somewhere in her expression in a way she couldn't quite name but could see. She looked like herself. That would have to be enough. Caleb was in the kitchen when she came downstairs, which surprised her. He'd been sleeping later since his hip had gotten worse in the cold, and this morning was cold. the kind of sharp October cold that settled into old injuries and made them known. He was standing at the stove with his back to her, and he'd made coffee, and when she came in, he turned and looked at her with the expression she'd been watching evolve over the past weeks, the slow, difficult movement of a man rearranging the stories he'd told himself about himself. "I want to come," he said. She looked at him. "It's not necessary. I know it's not necessary." He poured the coffee and set hers in front of her place at the table. "I want to be there." She thought about it for a moment, about what it would mean to have him in that room, whether it would complicate things or simplify them, whether Corrigan had any opinion on the matter. "It's a formal hearing," she said. "Not a trial. There won't be much for you to do." "I'm not going to do anything," he said. "I'm going to sit in the back and watch my daughter handle something I helped make necessary." He said it without self-pity, just the flat acknowledgement of someone who has identified the truth of his situation and is choosing to face it without looking away. "Let me come, all right," she said. Lydia came down at 6, already dressed, and said she was coming too. Mara didn't argue with either of them. There was a version of this where she showed up alone, carrying her own cause, with no visible support. And that version had a kind of integrity. She'd always been drawn to the self-sufficient version, the version that needed nothing from anyone. But she'd been living in that version for long enough to know that its integrity was real, and its cost was also real. And this morning, she let herself have the other thing. People who were there because they wanted to be, not because she'd asked them. Silas arrived at 7 on the dot, as he always did. He looked at the 3 of them assembled in the kitchen and said nothing about it, just poured himself the last of the coffee and stood with it near the door. Corrigan was meeting them at the county seats directly. They rode in the Whitlock wagon, which was not impressive but was functional and was hers, and Mara drove it herself because that was simply what she did. County seat was a town of about 400 people called Marston, 12 miles east. And by the time they arrived, the main street was already busy with the ordinary Tuesday morning commerce of a functioning small town. Courthouse was a 2-story building of pale limestone that the county had built 15 years ago with the particular ambition of a community that wanted to look more permanent than it felt. Corrigan was waiting on the front steps with his document case and his leather notebook, and the expression of a man who had already been inside, already checked the room, already thought about where everyone should sit. He pulled Mara aside before they went in. "Crow has retained Aldous Pemberton," he said. His voice was even, but she heard the particular quality of evenness that means a person is working to maintain it. "Pemberton is out of Houston. He's handled significant land cases in 3 counties, and he wins more than he loses." Mara took that in. "How much does that change things?" "It doesn't change the evidence," Corrigan said. "It changes the presentation. Pemberton is very good at making complicated things appear simple and simple things appear complicated, depending on which effect he needs. He'll try to reframe the acquisition dates as routine business practice. He'll argue that Crow's investment in the Dallas firm doesn't constitute control of the firm's decisions." He paused. "He may also try to argue that your father's signature was given with full understanding, and that any confusion about the terms is retroactive." "My father didn't understand the terms," Mara said. "I know that. You know that." Pemberton will argue that a man of 62 who has managed a ranch and his own finances for decades can be expected to understand a loan document, and that his claim not to understand it is convenient. She looked at him. "What do you need from me?" "Be precise," Corrigan said. "Not emotional. Precise. Everything you say it like you've read the document 3 times, because you have. Don't anticipate where Pemberton is going, and don't get ahead of his questions. Answer what he asks, and nothing more." He met her eyes. "You're the best witness in this case, Mara. You know more about this situation than anyone in that room, including Crow. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." She nodded. They went inside. The hearing room was smaller than she'd expected and fuller. The circuit judge, a man named Aldrin Foss, who she'd seen at county meetings but never spoken to directly, was already seated at the front bench. which was raised slightly in the manner of every courthouse she'd ever been in, as if altitude were the physical expression of authority. He was 50-something, with the carefully neutral expression of a man who has learned to keep his reactions private until he's ready to share them. There was a court recorder at a small desk to his left. The room had 12 chairs arranged for observers, and they were mostly full. She recognized Agnes Petty and her husband near the back, and Clara Marsh in the second row, and 3 other people whose names she knew from county meetings, and, occupying one of the front observer chairs, Roy Harland, who had come after all. She hadn't known he was coming. She looked at Agnes, who gave her the small nod of someone who has done a thing she hoped would be useful, and is not certain it was, but did it anyway. Crow was already at the respondent's table. He was dressed as he always dressed, expensive, deliberate, the clothes of a man performing the role of a man with authority. He had Aldous Pemberton beside him, who was younger than she'd expected, maybe 42, with a quick, organized face, and the particular posture of a lawyer who has stood in many rooms and learned to take up exactly the right amount of space in each of them. Pemberton glanced at her when she came in, then back at his papers. It was a professional glance, quick and assessing. She met it without adjusting anything about herself. She sat at the table beside Corrigan. Caleb and Lydia took seats in the observer row. Silas sat at the end of the same row, with the unhurried posture of someone who is there for the long duration and has made peace with that fact. Judge Foss called the hearing to order with a single knock of his gavel, not theatrical, just definitive, and the room settled. Corrigan presented their case first. He was methodical and clear in the way he'd been at the Whitlock kitchen table. No flourish, no dramatics, just the sequential, documented presentation of facts in the order that made their relationship to each other most visible. He entered the Dallas acquisition record into evidence. He entered the wire from Silas's Dallas contact, confirming Crow's investor status in the firm. He entered the timeline comparison, showing that Crow had purchased the instrument 11 months before the note was signed, with the 3-month gap between purchase and signing clearly marked. He entered the record of Caleb Whitlock's account of the Beaumont visit, taken in a sworn statement 2 days earlier. He entered Corrigan's own notes from the county gathering, establishing Crow's public behavior and the explicit marriage for debt offer as part of the documented record. He did not over-explain. He did not tell the judge what to think. He laid the pieces down in sequence and let the sequence speak. Then Pemberton stood up. He was good. She'd been told he was good, and she'd believed it abstractly, and now she watched it in practice and understood it concretely. He didn't attack the evidence directly that would have looked defensive. Instead, he recontextualized. He began by establishing, in broad and sympathetic terms, Crow's history in the county as a landowner, taxpayer, and a participant in the local economy. He noted that private investment in lending firms was common business practice throughout Texas and had been for decades. He noted that the purchase of distressed debt was equally common, equally legal, and equally practiced by banks, private investors, and individuals throughout the state without any implication of fraud. He noted calmly and without apparent unkindness that Caleb Whitlock was a man who had been managing finances for 30 years, and that the claim he did not understand a loan document he signed was a claim the court would need to evaluate carefully against the reasonable expectation of a grown man's comprehension. Then he looked at Mara. The central question in this case, he said, to the judge rather than to her, is whether a series of legal business transactions, each individually unimpeachable, can be characterized as fraud based on the retrospective inference of intent. And the court should consider carefully who is making that inference, and why, and what alternative explanations exist for the facts as presented. The alternative explanation, Pemberton went on to suggest, was straightforward. Crow was an investor in a Dallas firm that operated in rural Texas, as many investors did. That firm had extended a loan to a struggling ranching family, as rural lenders did regularly. Crow had subsequently purchased the note, again a standard practice, His offer to discharge the debt in exchange for marriage was unusual in form, but represented here, Pemberton's tone shifted slightly. Not quite sympathetic, but adjacent to it, the behavior of a man who had developed a genuine personal interest in a woman he admired, and had attempted to express that interest through a practical arrangement, perhaps misguidedly, but not fraudulently. Mara kept her hands flat on the table, and her face forward. Corrigan stood for rebuttal, and he was precise and unhurried, and he said, "The court will note that the instrument was purchased 11 months before the borrower was approached. This was standard investment activity. The court should ask what mechanism directed this specific firm, in which Mr. Crow held a financial interest, to approach this specific family, in this specific county, at this specific time, with terms specifically calibrated to generate a debt that Mr. Crow was positioned to acquire. Coincidence is an explanation. It is not a satisfying one." Judge Foss said he would hear witnesses. Clara Marsh went first. She was 61 and had the careful, deliberate diction of someone who has thought about what they were going to say. For a long time before saying it, she described, in plain and specific terms, the circumstances under which she had lost the northern 40 acres of her property 3 years earlier, debt she'd carried, the man who'd arrived offering a loan, the subsequent acquisition of that loan by Crow. The offer Crow had made not marriage, in her case, but a discounted land transfer that had left her without the parcel and without, she believed, a fair price for it. She had signed because she'd been afraid, and because the alternative had been presented as foreclosure, and because no one had told her she could fight it. Pemberton cross-examined her with professional courtesy and went after the specifics, the terms she'd been offered, what she'd read, what she'd understood at the time. Clara held up. She was not a dramatic witness. She was a factual one, and factual witnesses are hard to undermine because they're not claiming more than they know. Roy Harland went next. He was a big man, Roy, who had the slightly diminished look of someone who's been carrying something heavy and set it down recently but still walks like the weight is there. He told his story without looking at Crow, which Mara understood. He described the same pattern, a private loan, a subsequent acquisition, a pressure campaign. In his case, Crow had also dangled the possibility of favorable terms on adjacent land purchases, which had made the situation feel like an opportunity rather than a trap until it was too late to see it clearly. Pemberton's cross-examination of Roy was sharper. He pressed on the details of what Roy had understood, what he'd been told in writing versus verbally, whether he had sought legal advice. Roy hadn't sought legal advice. Most people in this county didn't, because legal advice cost money they didn't have. Pemberton didn't say that. He just established the gap between what Roy had been told and what he could prove he'd been told, and let the gap sit there. Then it was Mara's turn. She walked to the witness chair and sat down with the same posture she'd have used sitting at her own kitchen table. Not stiff, not performative, just present. She looked at the judge, who was looking back at her with an expression she still couldn't read. She looked at Corrigan, who gave her nothing because she didn't need anything. She did not look at Crow. Corrigan took her through the sequence of events from the beginning Crow's first morning visit, the note, her father's disclosure, the plan she'd developed, the transaction with Silas, the payment of the first debt, Crow's production of the second note. She answered each question with the precision she'd practiced. She gave dates where she had dates and described the absence of information where she hadn't had it, because the honest acknowledgement of what she didn't know was more credible than claiming she knew everything. When Corrigan got to the county gathering, he asked her to describe what Crow had said and what she had said in response. Scribes genomed it. And when you told the assembled community that Mr. Crow's method of acquisition revealed his intent, Corrigan said, "What were you basing that claim on?" "Timeline," she said. "A man who purchases an instrument before the debt it represents has been created is not a passive creditor who happened to acquire a note. He is someone who was present at the creation of the debt. Different thing. I didn't have the wire from Dallas yet when I said it at the gathering. but I had the dates on the document, and the dates told me the debt couldn't have been created independently of someone who already knew it was coming. Thank you, Corrigan said, and sat down. Pemberton stood up. He started gently, almost collegially, in the way that very good lawyers start cross-examinations when they intend to arrive somewhere uncomfortable by a route you don't see coming. He asked about her familiarity with investment structures, which she answered. Honestly, she had a rancher's understanding, not a lawyer's. He asked about the county survey she'd referenced, the water rights, whether she'd formally consulted anyone in legal authority before drawing her conclusions about the Eastern Forty's value. She said she hadn't, that she'd read the available public documents and drawn her own conclusions. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, Miss Whitlock, the transaction you undertook with Mr. Boone, the sale of the Eastern 40 and the Dunmore cattle, was that a transaction you entered into under financial pressure? Yes, she said. And the price you received, $4,700, was that your assessment of fair market value, or was it the number you needed? She looked at him. Both, she said. I wouldn't have agreed to a price that wasn't fair. And the number I needed was the number I chose to set as my floor. So you chose the asking price to match the debt. I chose the asking price based on what the property was worth. It happened to match the debt. If the property had been worth $3,000, I'd have sold it for $3,000 and found another way to address the rest. I don't set the value of land based on what I need. I set it based on what it is. Pemberton shifted. Your father signed both notes. Both debts are documented. Whatever the sequence of the acquisition, the underlying obligation exists. Are you arguing that your family shouldn't be required to repay money they borrowed? I'm arguing, she said, that a debt manufactured by the same party who holds it is not a legitimate loan. My father borrowed money he believed came from an independent lender. The lender was operating in the interests of the collector rather than the borrower. Then the loan was never independent. Obligation my father understood himself to be entering was not the obligation he actually entered. Problem. Pemberton looked at her for a moment, just a moment, then he said, No further questions. She walked back to her seat. The room was very quiet. Judge Foss took a recess that lasted 45 minutes. Mara sat in the hallway outside the hearing room with Corrigan and Silas and did not speak much. Corrigan reviewed his notes. Silas got water from the pump in the courthouse courtyard and brought her a cup without asking if she wanted it, which she drank because she was thirsty and because the gesture was exactly right in its practicality. Her father sat beside her for part of the recess and then got up and walked down the hall and stood at the window, at the end of it looking out at the street, and she let him have that. When they went back in, Judge Foss did not delay. The court finds, he said, in the measured, even tone of a man who has done this many times and understands the weight of it, that the acquisition timeline presented in evidence is sufficient to establish that the second note was not the product of an independent lending relationship. Gap between the instrument's acquisition by Mr. Crow's associated firm and the borrower's approach for the loan is 11 months, and no explanation has been offered that adequately accounts for this gap through ordinary business activity. He paused. Court further finds that the pattern of similar transactions, as described by two additional property owners in this jurisdiction, is consistent with a deliberate method rather than an accumulation of coincidental dealings. He looked at Crow directly for the first time. The second note is found to be fraudulently induced and is therefore void and unenforceable. Mr. Crow is ordered to surrender the instrument to the court for cancellation. Additionally, the court will refer the matter of the first note's acquisition to further review, as the court has concerns about whether the Abilene debt's transfer was conducted in accordance with the borrower's proper notification rights, which the evidence suggests was not fully observed. Pemberton was on his feet. Your Honor. The ruling is entered, Foss said, with the same even tone, slightly harder at the edges. You will have the opportunity to file an objection through appropriate channels, Mr. Pemberton. This hearing is concluded. The gavel came down. The room released. Mara sat very still for a moment. She heard the people behind her, and she heard Corrigan saying something beside her, and she heard stand up behind her, and the sound of the chairs and the movement of the room, and she sat still in the middle of all of it, and took one long breath that she'd been holding, it felt like, for 3 weeks. Then Caleb put his hand on her shoulder. He was standing behind her, and his hand on her shoulder was the hand of an old man who does not touch easily, and is touching now because he can't think of another way to say what he means. Put her hand over his and held it there for a moment. Lydia was crying quietly. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the quiet, genuine kind of crying that happens when a relief is large enough to require a physical expression, and small enough to manage privately. Mara looked at her cousin and saw in Lydia's face something she hadn't seen there before, not the careful social awareness, not the management of impression, but something simpler. Something that was just a person feeling something real. She reached over and briefly took Lydia's hand. Lydia looked at her. "We're all right," Mara said. They were outside, on the courthouse steps, when Crow came through the door. His lawyer was behind him, and Pemberton was saying something in a low, quick voice that Crow was not visibly responding to. He looked for the first time since she'd known of his existence like a man who had not gotten the thing he planned to get. Not destroyed, not collapsed, but smaller, somehow, in the way that a person's look smaller when the structure of certainty they've been standing inside loses a wall. He looked at Mara. She looked back. He did not speak to her. He walked down the steps and to his horse, and rode away with Pemberton, still trying to manage him, and she watched him go and felt nothing that surprised her. Not triumph, not relief, exactly. Something more like the particular feeling of a problem correctly solved, not the gladness of winning, but the specific satisfaction of having done a thing the right way and arrived at the right result. Agnes Petty found her at the bottom of the steps. "Well," Agnes said. "Well," Mara agreed. Agnes looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has something they want to say and is deciding whether this is the right moment. She decided it was. "I've been watching Crow operate in this county for 8 years, she said. "I've watched 3 families lose land. I've watched people settle because they didn't believe anyone would listen." She paused. "You made them listen. I want you to know that. I know that." Mara looked at the older woman. Agnes Petty was not given to sentiment. Neither was Mara. That made the statement mean more, not less, because it had been said carefully and was true. "Thank you for Vera Harland," Mara said, "and Roy." "Roy decided himself," Agnes said. "I think watching you stand up in that room at the gathering made it easier to decide." Roy Harland was on the steps above them, talking to his wife, and he caught Mara's eye and nodded once, a single, definitive nod, the kind that doesn't require anything added to it. She nodded back. Clara Marsh shook Mara's hand before she left, with the firm grip of a woman who rarely shakes hands but means it when she does, and said, "If they review the Abilene note transfer and find the same irregularity, you let me know." "I want to be there, I will," Mara said. Corrigan was the last. He shook her hand and said that the ruling was as good as the evidence warranted, which she understood as high praise from a man who did not traffic in higher praise than the evidence warranted. He said he'd send a final accounting of the fees and that she should take her time. She thanked him and meant it, and they parted on the steps with the clean simplicity of people who have done a together and done it well. She rode home in the wagon, Caleb beside her, Lydia in the back, Silas on horseback to her right. No one talked much for the first several miles. The road was drying from the week's rains, and the sky was the particular color of October in Texas, which was a pale, clear blue that had nothing sentimental in it, but was beautiful anyway. She drove the wagon with the same hands she'd used to set fence posts and sign documents and hold a coffee cup in a man's kitchen while she made a proposal that had started all of this, and she felt those hands on the reins as something continuous. The same hands, the same person doing what the situation required. About halfway home, Caleb said, "What happens now?" "With the ranch. We keep working it," Mara said. "The Eastern 40 is gone." The Eastern 40 is gone, she agreed. We'll work with what we have. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said on the porch. That you didn't need me to carry everything you needed me to tell you the truth. Remember, I've been doing the opposite of that for a long time. He said it. The way he said things he'd worked, through on his own, not looking for a response. Just setting it down somewhere outside himself. I told myself I was protecting you, your mother too, before she died. There were things she worried about that I didn't tell her because I thought it would spare her the weight. He paused. Found out anyway. About the debts, the first ones, before you were old enough to know. She was angry with me. She said the same thing you said, nearly the same words, though she said it a good deal less quietly. Mara looked at him. I didn't know that. No. He smiled, a small, tired, genuine thing. She was sharper than I've given her credit for, in the way I've talked about her since she died. I've been making her softer and the memory safer. He looked at his hands in his lap. She was like you. She would have figured it out the same way. That sat with Mara for a while. It sat with her the way things sit with you when they rearrange something you thought was settled. She had her mother's hands and her mother's eyes, and apparently she was only now learning her mother's particular brand of unwillingness to be managed for her own supposed good. She didn't know whether to find that funny or to cry about it, and settled somewhere in the middle miles of the road home, for something that was quietly both. When they reached the property line, and she turned the wagon through the gate, and the familiar land spread out around her. The near paddock, the repaired barn roof, the fence posts she'd set herself along the south pasture. She felt the particular weight of return that you only feel when you've been genuinely uncertain of coming back. Not uncertain in a dramatic sense, just uncertain in the way that any outcome you can't control contains uncertainty. And this one had been genuinely in the balance, still hers, all of it that mattered. In the weeks that followed, the county's review of the Abilene Notes transfer procedure found a technical deficiency in the notification process. Caleb had not been given the required 30-day notice of the notes sale to a third party, as was technically required by the lending agreement's terms. It was a smaller issue than the fraud finding, but it gave Corrigan grounds to argue that the first debts transfer to Crow had also been irregular. The outcome was a negotiated settlement. Crow agreed to surrender both notes in exchange for the court declining to pursue further action against him for the Abilene transfer irregularity. He got nothing from the Whitlock ranch. Not the land, not the debt, and certainly not Mara. He left the county the following spring. No announcement, no sale of his estate, he simply stopped appearing. And then word came through the ordinary county channels that he'd relocated to somewhere in New Mexico territory. Mara heard the news from Agnes Petty and said, all right, and went back to what she'd been doing. The work agreement she'd drawn up with Silas, the formal repayment schedule for the legal fees he'd advanced, was something she took seriously in the way. She took every financial obligation seriously, which was completely. She made the first payment 3 months after the hearing, when the fall cattle sales came through at better prices than she'd projected. She made the second 4 months later. By the end of the following year, the balance was cleared. The day she paid the last installment, she rode to his ranch with the payment and the signed receipt, which she'd had Corrigan prepare because she wanted the conclusion documented. The way everything that mattered to her was documented. Silas was in the near pasture when she arrived, working with a young horse that was still figuring out what it thought about saddles, and he left the horse with his foreman and came to meet her at the gate. She handed him the payment and the receipt. He looked at it and signed it and handed her the copy, and that was done. You didn't have to come in person, he said. I know. He looked at her. She had been around this man enough by now to read his silences the way she read weather, not perfectly, not with certainty, but well enough. This silence had something in it that he was deciding whether to say. I have a situation I'd like your advice on, he said. Not because I need someone to tell me what to do, because I'd like to know what someone with better instincts about this county's land thinks. She waited. I've been approached by a cattle buyer out of Colorado, he said. Contract for 2 years. Sizable, steady price regardless of market fluctuation. To fulfill it, I'd need to expand my operation. The natural expansion is south. He paused. Brings me to your property line. She looked at him. Contract would be profitable enough to split fairly, he said. I'm not talking about buying your land. I'm talking about a joint operation. Separate ownership, separate books, shared contract. You'd manage your portion of the cattle as you always have. I'd manage mine. He held her gaze. I'd want your name on the contract, not as a courtesy, because you know this land better than I do, and the buyer's representative will figure that out in about 10 minutes if we do any kind of property walk. She was quiet for a moment. She was doing the thing she always did, which was looking at the proposal from every angle, the financial structure, the risk distribution, the thing it would require her to give up or to trust. Separate ownership, separate books. Her name on the document as a genuine participant, not an appendage. I'd want to see the contract terms, she said. Of course, and I'd want Corrigan to review the joint operation agreement before I sign anything. So that's what I'd do in your position, he said. She looked at him. She had been looking at this man, really looking, the way she looked at land and cattle and ledgers and everything else she cared about for months now, and what she kept finding was the same thing she'd found in his kitchen. On that first morning, someone who saw what was actually there, not the size of her, not the inconvenience of her competence, not the problem of her independence, just the person. That was rarer than it should have been. She knew that. She had 31 years of evidence. Send me the terms, she said. I'll read them. She rode home with the receipt in her pocket and the particular feeling of something opening rather than closing, which was different from the relief after the hearing, and different from the satisfaction of the paid debt, and different from everything she'd felt in the hard months behind her. It was the feeling of possibility, which she had learned to be careful with, because possibility had disappointed her before, and because she was not a person given to optimism as a baseline condition. But she was also not a person who refused to see what was in front of her, and what was in front of her right now was real. Contract terms arrived. She read them, all of them, every line twice. She had Corrigan review the joint agreement. Corrigan had 2 suggested modifications, and Silas agreed to both of them without negotiation, which she filed away as information about his character without making more of it than it was. She signed the contract on a Thursday in early spring, at Corrigan's office in Marston, with Silas on one side and her name on the page above his in alphabetical order, which was how Corrigan had arranged them and which Silas had not rearranged. Shook hands. Corrigan poured a small amount of whiskey into 2 glasses and offered them without ceremony. Mara rarely drank whiskey and drank it this time because the occasion was real and she wanted to mark real occasions properly. It was, she thought, the most honest piece of paper she'd ever signed. She told her father about the contract that evening. He listened from his chair on the porch, wrapped in his coat against the spring chill, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your name first?" "Alphabetical order," she said. "Whitlock before Boone," he said. He smiled again, the same tired, genuine smile from the wagon ride home. "That's right." She sat beside him for a while, the way they'd sat the night before the hearing, and watched the last of the light go off the south pasture. The grass was coming in with the spring. The fence posts were all set level. Creek was audible in the distance, with the clear running sound of water that had found its course and was following it. Lydia moved out in April, which Mara had been expecting, and which turned out to be easier than she'd feared and harder than she'd admitted she feared. She moved to Marston, rented a room from a woman who ran a small boarding house, and found work helping to manage the books for 2 of the local merchants, which she was good at in the same careful, socially intelligent way she was good at most things. She came to the ranch for Sunday dinners when the road permitted, and those dinners were imperfect, some Sundays easy, some stiff with the particular awkwardness of people who love each other and have hurt each other and are trying to find the right distance, but they happened. Regularly, that was something. The first summer of the joint contract was hard work, and better returns than Mara had projected, which meant her projection had been conservative, which was how she always projected, because she didn't trust optimism, but she could be pleasantly wrong. She and Silas developed the working rhythm of the operation, the way any two people develop a working rhythm through disagreement and adjustment, and the gradual discovery of where each person's instincts could be trusted and where they needed checking. They disagreed twice about pasture rotation and once about a hired hand, and in each case they reached a resolution through the unfashionable method of saying directly what they each thought until they'd thought it through together far enough to find the answer. She did not fall in love with him the way she'd read about falling in love, which was sudden and total and reorganizing. She fell in love with him the way she'd come to trust, that things worth trusting were actually built gradually, through demonstrated evidence, through the accumulation of small proofs that added up to a large certainty. She fell in love with him across kitchen tables and property lines, and the particular honesty of two people who have agreed to see each other clearly and are, improbably, managing to do it. He asked her to marry him in the fall, on the property line between their two ranches, which was not a romantic location by most standards and was exactly right by hers. He asked directly, without theater, with the same quality of attention he brought to everything he'd decided mattered to him, and she said yes with the same directness, and they stood on the boundary line between their two pieces of land that were and would remain their two separate pieces of land and shook hands. And then, because that was insufficient, he put his arms around her, and she let herself be held, which was not something she did easily, and was something she found she had wanted for a long time. They married the following spring. She wore a dress she made herself blue wool, cut to fit her body the way she was, not the way anyone thought she should be. The ceremony was small. Agnes Petty, Clara Marsh, Roy Harland and his wife, who had come back to the county and who were building something new, slowly, on land they'd found further east. Corrigan, who wore the same jacket he wore to every formal occasion, and would have apologized for it if anyone had asked, and was not asked. Caleb, who sat in the front chair and looked at his daughter through the whole of it, with an expression she couldn't quite name and didn't need to. Lydia came. She was different than she'd been, not transformed, not rebuilt, but shifted. She had started keeping company with a school teacher in Marston, a quiet man, who read a great deal and had no particular interest in owning things. She seemed, for the first time, that Mara could observe from the outside, to be navigating toward something she'd chosen rather than something she'd been told to want. They did not become the kind of sisters who had never had friction. They became the kind of cousins who called each other by their first names without ceremony, and who occasionally sat across from each other at a dinner table and said the thing they actually meant, better than what they'd had before, which had been affection wrapped in management, was real, which was worth more. The two ranches remained separate entities. The books were separate. The land was separate. Colorado contract ran for 2 years and then was renegotiated on better terms because Mara had built a relationship with the buyer's representative during the first contract through the straightforward method of knowing what she was talking about and being honest when she didn't. And the representative had decided they were the most reliable operation he worked with in 3 counties. The renegotiation was Mara's work. Silas reviewed the terms and agreed with her position, which he sometimes did and sometimes didn't, and on the 2 occasions, he didn't. They talked it through until someone's thinking changed, and once it was hers, and once it was his, and neither of them kept score. Caleb died in the winter 4 years after the wedding. It was his heart, finally, which had been managing less efficiently for the last 2 years, and it went on a cold night in January, with the particular undramatic quietness of a body that has done its work and is finished. Mara was with him. He had been sleeping, and then he had not been, and there was nothing in the transition that she could point to as the moment which she had expected to be distressing and found, in the actual experience of it, simply true. He had lived long enough to see everything, and he had seen it clearly enough at the end to know what it was worth. She buried him beside her mother on the hill, at the north edge of the property, where the grass came in early, every spring. She stood at the grave in the cold and said what she meant about him, which included the hard things, and the true things, and the things she loved, and she didn't leave anything important out. She thought about what it meant to try to protect people by managing the truth of things which he'd done, and which had cost both of them, and which she understood now had come from love, even when love is insufficient as an excuse. She thought that the impulse to protect the people you love by controlling what they know is one of the oldest human failures, ancient and understandable and still a failure. And she thought that the only protection worth offering is the kind that trusts the person you love to carry what is real. Because the alternative is not protection, but a smaller life hidden inside a larger one. She had spent years carrying what was real, and it had not broken her. She had wanted him to know that for longer than she'd been able to say it, and she believed, by the end, that he had. Years passed the way. Years pass when you are working, and the work matters, and the people beside you are real, not quickly, not slowly, but with the density of days that contain something worth remembering. The joint operation expanded. Culver Creek water rights resolved exactly as Mara had predicted 5 years earlier, and the Eastern 40 that she had sold to Silas became, in the quiet business language of county land dealings, a strategically significant parcel, which meant she had been right, which she noted without particular satisfaction, because being right about something you've already acted on is just confirmation, not reward. The county changed around them. New families came in. Old grievances resolved or calcified into things people learned to step around. The story of the Crow case became one of those county stories that gets simplified in the retelling. In the simplified version, Mara Whitlock had beaten a corrupt landowner in court and kept her ranch. It was true, but left out everything that made it actually worth understanding. She corrected the simplified version when she heard it and let the rest of it go. Because you cannot control how a story travels, only how you tell it yourself. She became known in time as the best land manager in the county, which was accurate. People came to ask her advice about pasture management, about water rights, about reading survey documents, and understanding what they actually meant for a working ranch's long-term prospects. She gave the advice directly, without softening it, for people who might not want to hear it, and she was occasionally wrong and said so. When she was number one, she built, from the accumulation of all of it, a reputation that was not about her gender or her size, but about the quality of her judgment, which was what she had always been offering, and what the world had always been slow to accept. The slowness had not broken her. She thought about that sometimes, about the years of being looked past, evaluated by the wrong measures, told in 100 small and large ways that the space she took up was the wrong kind of space. She did not feel grateful for those years, exactly. She did not believe that suffering is instructive in some necessary or ennobling way, because she had watched it break people who deserved better than to be broken. But she had used what those years had given her, the specific knowledge of her own capacity, the proof that she could face hard things, and come through them with her judgment intact, and she had used it towards something real. That was not a lesson she could give anyone. It was a thing that had to be lived. Her granddaughter, Nell, was 7 when she came running into the kitchen one afternoon in late October, with her face red from cold, and something else, the particular high color of a child who has been hurt and is trying to manage it with a dignity she doesn't quite have the experience for yet. Marza was at the table with a survey document spread out before her and a cup of coffee, and she looked up and read the child's face the way she read everything that mattered. "Sit down," she said. Nell sat. She was large for her age, the way Mara had been large for her age, with the same kind of hands and the same quality of stillness when she was paying attention. She looked at her grandmother across the table with the eyes of a child who is deciding whether the adult in front of her is safe to be honest with. "The Merriman boys said I was too big," Nell said, "that girls aren't supposed to be that big." Mara looked at her granddaughter. She thought about what she wanted to say. Not the comfortable version, not the reassuring lie, not the kind of well-meaning reduction that makes a child feel better for 10 minutes and leaves the real thing unaddressed. She thought about what was actually true. The Merriman boys, she said, are going to grow up and find that the world is full of things that are bigger than they expected. Some of those things will be women. She paused. That's their problem to work out, not yours. Nell considered this, but they made fun of me. I know. It hurts. It's supposed to hurt. It's designed to. People say things like that because they want the person they're saying it to get smaller. Mara held her granddaughter's gaze. You are not going to get smaller. You're going to get bigger, stronger, and one day you're going to know things about land and cattle and how the world actually works that those boys will not know. And none of that is going to happen if you spend the next 40 years trying to take up less space. She put her hand on Nell's hand, the same kind of hands. You are not too much. You are exactly who you are. Now build a life that fits you. Nell looked at her for a long moment with the gravity of a child, receiving something she doesn't fully understand yet, but can feel the weight of. Then she nodded once and got up and went back outside. Mara watched her go through the kitchen window, watched the child cross the yard with her head up and her stride, the stride of someone who has been told something important and is deciding to believe it. She watched until Nell disappeared around the corner of the barn, and then she sat with the quiet of the kitchen and the survey document in front of her and the coffee going cold. Silas came in from the back pasture. A few minutes later, stamping the mud off his boots at the door the way he always did, with the same insufficient thoroughness he'd always had about it. He looked at her face and said, "What happened?" "Nell had a hard afternoon," Mara said. "She's all right now." He poured coffee and sat across from her and looked at the survey she'd been reading. The Hendricks boundary markers? They've moved them again. She turned the document toward him, 2 feet east. Third time in 4 years he looked at it. Do you want to file a formal objection or handle it directly? Directly, she said. I'll ride out tomorrow and show them the original markers. It's probably an honest mistake. And if it's not, picked up her coffee cup. Then also file. He looked at her over the document with the expression she knew well. By now, the particular mix of attention and warmth that had no performance in it. That was just what his face did when he was looking at something he valued. She looked back at him with the same quality of regard, unguarded, because she had learned, over the years of this, that guardedness with someone you trust is just a habit from when you didn't, and she was done with old habits that no longer served her. Outside, the afternoon light was going gold off the south pasture, the way it did in October in Texas, clear and unhurried and indifferent to human concerns, in a way she had always found more comforting than otherwise. The land was as it had been hers, productive, imperfect, carrying the accumulated evidence of 3 years of her grandmother's hands and 20-odd years of her mother's, and 30-plus years of her own, and whatever would come after. She had not waited for the world to decide she was worth something. She had decided it herself and built the evidence and made people deal with what was actually true about her rather than what was convenient to believe. That was the whole of it. Not a secret, not a particularly elegant conclusion, not the kind of lesson that fits neatly into a sentence. Just the plain, durable truth of what a life looks like when a person refuses, steadily and without great drama, to make themselves smaller than they are. She turned back to the survey document. There was work to do.